And welcome to another episode of Doubl3Tap. Today we are joined by Alex Paley, the co-founder of Faraway. Faraway is like a publisher platform, also developing their own games. Alex, hey man, how are you?
Pretty good. How are you guys doing?
So excited today to talk a bit more about incentives, collateralized LTV, and a couple other juicy topics. But before that, Alex, what games are you currently playing?
Everything and anything, obviously our games. So I'll do like a quick plug for Serum City. Dookie Dash is coming. We have Shatterline coming. There's Rebel Skies, which is like a published game with like a good partner coming. As far as games I'm really like deep into right now, I'm still working my way through the new FF7 like Rebirth. Um, I'm replaying Burnout Paradise, if you know that game. I have now bought that game on almost every single platform
So good.
for the low price of $2.99. You know, whenever I see that game go on sale, regardless of the platform, I'm on it. Yeah, I've just been playing a bunch of Slay the Spire. I've been playing a bunch of that recently, sort of like in my downtime. It's one of the few, like, I think Steam games that actually works on Mac. But yeah, just I think the big one for me is just working my way through Final Fantasy.
You should add the new Black Myth Wukong game to your list. I know a lot of people have been talking about
I
it, but
saw it go crazy today. I've been following that game for like 4 years.
yeah,
It was like that E3 trailer, it crushed, and then yeah, I've been following like that studio for a while. But yeah, I think the game blew past every single expectation. It was like 2.2 million CCUs in Steam. It's just absolutely insane.
good for them, man. Yeah, like fairly unknown Chinese studio just comes out with a banger. So I know we'll see if they
Good
can
pedigree
replicate
though.
that.
They have the pedigree to know how to work hard. So I think this will be a interesting like moment of reflection for Western AAA dev. I will say that. And I think the big coming out party for I think really China AAA dev at this point. I mean, this is I think the first massive. I think what we'd ever consider like AAA. Of course, there's like the MiHoYo stuff, but this is I think a different level or a different type of game. I think when it comes to like graphical quality, storytelling, yeah, all of that type of stuff. So yeah, I think kudos to that team.
yeah, it's phenomenal. I could talk more about it, but we'll get right into it. One question that we'd love to hear your take on is you hear this on crypto Twitter all the time. What's the product? Is it the game? Is it the token? Is it some combination of both? Where do you kind of net out on that in terms of
I think
building
it's sort of
games, designing tokens, that sort of thing?
I think it has to be both. Like if you have a token and the game sucks, then that's not going to work. If you have a game but the token has no utility at all and no purpose, don't launch the token to begin with. I think if you want to have some sort of like Web3 economy in your game, you need to have an actual utility for, fungible tokens, NFTs, and of course, I think the game needs to, stand by itself and be fun and sustainable and all of those things that a game should be. But I think it has to be both. It's the game and the token because I think you need just both types of people. The people that are there for the game first and foremost, the people that come in and they say, hey, this token's blowing up, or I'm interested in speculating on the token or the assets, and they come in for that reason. But I think you just need two sides of players for an economy to work.
Are there any particular ways in which you think the game services the token and the token services the game that you've seen people do well, whether it's on the Faraway platform, games you guys have developed, or others?
Where the game services the token. I mean, so at Faraway, the big thing for us is like interoperable assets. I'll just speak about like NFTs for now because we don't have our own tokens. For us, it's about yeah, interoperable assets, interoperable utility between games. So like heavy metal, for example, it's usable in I think it's like 4 or 5 different games at this point, where a person loves their asset. They are now checking out new games that give utility to the assets that they love. And they say, you know what, like I like this game. I like idle games, or I like strategy games, or I like base builders, or I like competitive games like Dookie Dash. And they find the game that's good for them, but they come in because they have an asset that they really love and they want to play with that IP in a variety of games. So that's I think a situation where like it sort of starts with the asset and then it leads into the game. And then we have people that like start with the game and they discover that they really like the IP, right? So I think Shadowline is a good example. So this is a game that we're publishing that'll come out later this year. The game was like a big AAA shooter. People came in, they absolutely loved the game. It has like 2.3 million like installs at this point. But now we're sort of introducing NFT communities into the game. So now we have a bunch of players that are saying, hey, like, what is heavy metal? Like, what is Legends of the Mara? Like I'm gonna win these assets from playing the game. Okay, cool. What's the next thing I'm gonna do? I'm gonna go try a bunch of different games that give utility to those assets that I now have. So that's why I'm saying we have this more ecosystem approach to a game developer or publisher. And we use these interoperable assets to create that, more stickiness and glue that keeps people within our ecosystem.
I think you guys are in a bit of a unique position where so most games will launch their own assets and then have to deal with like how do we build up the hype for a sale or a free bin and then sustain that or potentially like grow over time, whereas you're kind of implementing or integrating NFTs that have already had like a fairly long shelf life,
Mm-hmm.
and like with a holder base that's been like desperate for utility in some ways. I wonder if that like changed the dynamic at all, maybe made it a bit easier because you're coming here as like, I don't know, this sort of long awaited utility, or has it been really challenging?
I mean, so these games, just of course, they give utility to existing NFTs. But if you take Serum City as an example, it also produces its own NFTs as well. It's called like there's collections they call like Chaos Gear. It's like craftable gear that you produce from all of these crafting loops inside the game. But we were like pretty calculated early on about making sure that we were constantly managing like a global supply cap of each type of NFT that exists. Because I think the reason a lot of these NFTs plummet in price is because there's too many that exist and not enough utility, right? So if there's an oversupply and a lack of demand, obviously, when it comes to a gaming NFT, at least this is like my belief. Of course, the price is going to go down just because there's too much supply and not enough demand. So even in Serum City, for example, we have global supply caps. So we have these constant crafting loops where assets are minted, then assets are burned, and people cannot produce more assets or more assets of a specific type until some of those assets of that specific type are burnt away, right? So we haven't seen this complete collapse in value because we have tighter like quantity controls over the assets that are produced in game. I think the situations that you want to stay away from are like this constant faucet of assets that will never get burned away.
When you're thinking about driving utility to these financialized assets, which in your case it's NFTs, but more broadly it's also tokens in the gaming ecosystem, how does that change the way in which you think about like monetization and distribution at Faraway for either games you guys just publish or games you guys develop as well?
Yeah, so I mean, I'd say we're more like Web 2.5 than like ultra Web 3. Like we do need some types of monetization that are like outside of the syncing fungible tokens. Basically, so we monetize our games with, there's a portion that of course is monetized with, syncing fungible tokens, staking NFTs for access to new things, like staking NFTs for a battle pass or staking NFTs to improve some crafting loop in Serum City. Like that's an example. But we still, I mean, my background is in free to play, right? So we still believe that there's a lot of value in a combined like Web3 and like free to play type of monetization. And you sort of need the two to have a more healthy and sustainable game. Because you do need actual like true sinks of of uh, of currency.
And clearly, you guys have kind of experience playing around with some of these levers across a variety of different titles. Do you think the financial aspect of crypto, does it belong in the core loop? Does it belong in the metagame?
I think like crypto, NFTs, it's very metagame centric. It can help in the UA side of things. Like we use it a lot for UA, right? How can I take this community and bring it to this game? Like, okay, one of the ways to do that is you give utility to those NFTs or those fungible tokens. But I think when it comes to yeah, like where does crypto fit in? It's more on like the metagame side of things. Typically, if you think outside of the UA, like I don't know what crypto would do for a core gameplay. Like how does it make a how does it improve the moment to moment physics of a action RPG? Like it doesn't, but it does create like interesting metagame systems or financialized systems, right? It's like peer to peer trading is one thing. Like that's I think like that's like very some betting, right, is another thing. Like betting, you could argue, is much simpler when you have automatic payouts. People put in money to a pool, an outcome happens, and then the money is distributed. And Faraway or the studio doesn't act as the transmitter, right? A smart contract acts as the transmitter. So it's much cleaner from a who is the person distributing these payments because it's not a business anymore. It's a smart contract and everything is programmatic. So I think, yeah, there's the metagame side of things for like, rarity, scarcity of assets that can be interesting for peer-to-peer trading. And then betting, I think, is a very interesting use case.
One of
Yeah.
one of the things I thought was really interesting about like the early days of Dookie Dash, and I think some of the other early Yuga releases was like really crazy high average revenue per user. I
Hmm.
think it was like in the range of like $250 to $300.
Yeah.
I'm curious now. I would say like probably a portion of that, potentially a large
Per
portion.
paying user, by the way. ARPPU
Yeah,
would be like a $300 outcome.
and
ARPU was, I think, sub 100.
I mean, still for what it was,
It's,
it's crazy, right?
it's yeah, it's so incredible.
I think a portion, perhaps a large portion of that was down to like speculation of future release of assets or like some player score and a rank in a leaderboard. Now that things on the Yuga roadmap have changed a little bit, and you guys have kind of taken control over there, and it's more of a live service game. Are you still seeing like pretty big numbers? Do you think it's just inherent of like an inherent trait of like Web3 native users?
Yeah, I mean, so there was Dookie Dash, and then there's Dookie Dash Unclogged, which is currently in soft launch. It's like in a geo locked like soft launch, so it's not in the US yet. It's coming. Um, this game, the strategy is very different, right? So in Dookie Dash 1, it was NFT gated. So only specific people who had these specific, sewer passes were able to play the game. So of course people were trading the passes because that was the only way to get into the game. So the per user numbers were crazy because it was a locked game that was locked to, thousands of users. Um, when Dookie Dash Unclogged is a bit of a different strategy where it's trying to get, of course, the Web3, like DD1 users back in the game, but it's trying to expand much past that initial audience and just go to the more mainstream, traditional mobile gamer. So the metrics are, of course, going to look very different, and they do look very different, but that's a good thing because in order to make a more sustainable game, especially if this is a more casual game, we need a lot of players. In gaming, there's always like a carrot. Like, what are you playing a game for? Like, you're playing a game for some sort of reward, some sort of progress. It could be a rare item. It could be a badge. It could be you're competing to go up in a leaderboard, and that leaderboard has a monetary prize pool. Like you're always playing for something, or what's the point? And I'm talking more about free to play types of games. The loops and the behaviors you're trying to create are very different, where it's more about like a constant chase.
And when that constant chase is like purely financial, right, where like rewards can be extracted, do you
Mhm.
think there's room for just free to play to earn mechanics, or yeah, how do you kind of?
I think the earning you need to gate behind something, right? It can be some level of progress and some time investment in the game. I think better would be some sort of monetary investment or something that translates into some monetary um, gain by the studio. I think the thing you want to prevent is like a bunch of well, I think the worst case, right, is a civil attack. The second worst case is a bunch of farmers coming in, destroying your economy because they're playing the game 24/7, right? And minting all your assets for free and then destroying the supply. But you can control their earning in a lot of different ways. Like I talked earlier about global supply caps. Like you can set, like for this resource in this MMO, there is only a certain amount that can ever be created at a certain given point in time. So you can control things there. Um, you can say, hey, in order, this is like the Pirate Nation thing, right? In order to trade, you must have like the equivalent of like it's a trading pass. You can do what Pixels did, right? Which is you need some VIP pass in order to really gain access to the earning component. I think everybody is like you need to gate earning in some way for you to have a sustainable game. Even back in Mini Royale, like you weren't even allowed to mint your asset until your player level, I think it was like level 20, and then you had to level up each item to like level 10 in order to mint it, and then there was a minting cost, right? So you always want to do things to prevent um, somebody attacking your game economy and introducing any sort of hyperinflation, whether it's on a specific asset class, a specific asset, or the game economy as a whole.
Are there any learnings from some of the earlier games that maybe were a little bit out of the box, right? So, like, I would say one of the like obvious things here is like, hey, like make sure you're controlling the supply. But are there any things
Yeah.
like out of left field that you think like would be helpful for other builders with respect to kind of managing that earning potential? Um,
Yeah, if you're trying to, well, I mean, this isn't factoring to earning, but if you're trying to sell cosmetics and that's the only thing that you're trying to monetize in your game and you're trying to make cosmetic NFTs, like don't do it. It doesn't work. You might as well just sell the same thing to every single person in like a free to play way. And that's going to make you a lot more money versus now allowing trading between users and having to say like, hey, this asset is legendary, like because only a certain amount exists, right? So as a game studio, you can only mint, let's say, 5 legendary assets ever because now you're worried about both rarity and scarcity.
Does it impact game design?
Yeah, definitely. Right. It's like, if you have like a marketplace, like we have our own marketplace, where we clip fees for use of our marketplace. So yeah, if you're designing a game that is about like driving GMV, right? You're just constantly trying to push more product and you're trying to clip fees from that huge amount of product that you're pushing through um, your ecosystem or your tooling. And then you need to worry about like the global supply of those items. So you never need to, or you never have a situation where there's too much of an item and then the price just completely plummets and is difficult to model and is a bad experience for all players and game designers.
You've to go back to what you said earlier about like uh, monetizing on like NFT cosmetics doesn't really work. I'm curious how you view interoperable assets within the ecosystem, because I think when most people hear that, they think about like cosmetics, right, and bringing one from the other.
Yeah.
I know it can also be applied to player IDs and stuff like that, but yeah, would be curious how you guys are tackling that within
Yeah,
Faraway.
interoperability, it's about UA, it's not monetization. So I think that's the very large distinction. Like interoperability is cross promotion on steroids, right? It's how do you keep a person like in your ecosystem? Like, well, I guess more so, how do you acquire a person into your ecosystem? And then how do you keep them like sticky within your ecosystem? It has nothing to do with monetization.
Okay, and so for you guys, that's partnering with third-party IPs to acquire new users and then giving them new experiences the longer they stay in the ecosystem.
Yeah. And then we have a bunch of tools that can clip, little fees, right? We have our own marketplace. We have a bunch of products that can take little fees of all the transactions that happen within our ecosystem. But from a publisher standpoint, it's very important that we keep people in our ecosystem because then we can tell all of the games that we want to publish, like, hey, we have like a captive audience that would be hungry for this type of game you're making. Like, we don't have to acquire the same user over again into your game, like, because we already have them in our ecosystem somewhere. And we can push them from one game to another game or make it attractive for them to at least try out your game. Or we can run UA to your game because we're monetizing that player on an ecosystem basis, even if we're acquiring them to a game that we don't own 100% of the revenue of. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, I think we're already kind of seeing this in Web2 world, where you're starting to see the mobile publishers launch web apps and basically try and own the user
Yeah.
and do exactly what you just described. I'm curious if you believe like blockchain integrations add anything to that process that can't be achieved otherwise.
I think you can have interoperable assets like off chain. I think it's like harder. I think when you have an asset that's closed in your ecosystem, you sort of close the door on these emergent things that can happen, like heavy metals, for example. There could be something that's very valuable created for heavy metals that we wouldn't be able to tap into if heavy metals weren't an NFT, right? There's like a renting platform called Zarda that we have nothing to do with, but it actually was a huge benefactor for some of our games because now we have a bunch of people that can rent heavy metals, like come play with them in our games, and then like that's good for us, right? But we didn't have to make those tools. And they're doing user acquisition for us saying, hey, come rent your heavy metal from Zarda and come play Faraway's games. Like if this was back in the Scopely days, that wouldn't be possible. It's like Scopely would need to build every single tool themselves. I mean, every Web2 publisher always runs into this same thing where, I mean, this is back in the day before everybody was making their own ecosystems and have their own IDs. They were acquiring the same user like a million times into different games that were all inside of their ecosystem. It's sort of like insane. Like, you have, it's Scopely, right? You had WWE and you had like Marvel Strike Force. Realistically, those are two character collection RPGs. The person who's playing Marvel Strike Force will probably play WWE and vice versa. But why would you run two different UA campaigns to acquire the same player to an ecosystem, right? It's just like another product in your ecosystem where you should just try to keep them in your ecosystem and then do things outside of the typical Facebook, Google, TikTok, etc. types of user acquisition platforms.
Aside from the inherent like traits of NFTs, is there anything else that you're doing to kind of encourage composability, like you mentioned before with the renting platform?
Yeah, I mean, we try to like encourage as many people as possible, like whether it's creators making their own games. We provide tools for any game developer to give utility and like make their own games with some sort of Web3 functionality. We try to like promote products that we think would be like useful to the NFTs or to our ecosystem as a whole. But yeah, I mean, our goal is to, yeah, I think give as much utility to the NFTs that are in our ecosystem. and then partner with products that we think would bring users into our ecosystem, like or lower the barrier of entry for people to play the games in our ecosystem.
One thing you mentioned earlier was this concept of collateralized LTV. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about this concept of collateralized LTV, how you think about it, and how it relates to some of the things you just said with respect to not having to reacquire the same user and then continue to bring these like daisy chain of rewards to the user to provide them value with the IP or the games that they've already started to build this affinity for?
Yeah. So like think of it from I'll try to give it like some examples. So like let's say you have a hyper casual game, right? It costs you 25 cents to acquire that user. Like if they only played that hyper casual game, maybe their LTV is 20 cents. Like, and you're just like, oh shit, I'm in trouble because it costs me more to acquire the user than their LTV. But if you now say, okay, this user is part of my ecosystem. I'm going to take this user from the hyper casual game and I'm going to push them into another game. And because that game is in our ecosystem and we can continue to clip fees, their LTV in the hyper casual game was 20 cents. But okay, now they're playing Serum City, which is a mid core game. And now they spent $1, right? So now the LTV for that user is $1.20. So now all of a sudden you start modeling this out and you say, you know what, if I keep this user in my ecosystem, I can continue to increase the LTV, right, of that user over time by keeping them in the ecosystem. And now what you say is like, you know what, like I have this hyper casual like top of funnel, right, where I can acquire users super cheaply. Like I was paying 25 cents to acquire users, but because I know that the ecosystem LTV of my user might actually be $10, I'm going to go crazy and I'm going to start paying a crazy amount to acquire all of these users into my ecosystem, steal every single user possible because I know my LTV basically is better than everybody else's because my LTV I am looking at from like an ecosystem level versus a single game level. And now all of a sudden you have this UA flywheel that everybody else doesn't have. So it's about acquiring a user through like a very like cheap to acquire product and then keeping them in your ecosystem by whatever means possible and increasing their LTV by moving them through specific games in your ecosystem that you think might be higher LTV types of games, and then having them interact with other products in your ecosystem, which might be a marketplace or might be like a checkout product where you're clipping fees.
And can you talk a little bit about how that kind of informs the way in which you guys decide what types of games to publish or develop? So, in other words, if you're taking a hyper casual game, right, then you're probably looking at, okay, what type of genres can we kind of convert those guys kind of up the LTV scale, let's say, from like the hyper to the hybrid casual to maybe the mid core?
A web game is going to be cheaper to acquire a user into than a mobile game, and a mobile game is going to be cheaper than a PC game and a console game, right? So I think look at our portfolio right now. We have Mini Royale, which is like a browser shooter, like super mass market, right? We have Serum City, which is like a mid-core crafting base builder game, like also on browser, but a much deeper meta, right? We have Dookie Dash, which is sort of like in between. Even though it looks like a hyper casual game, it's not. It's more of like a hybrid casual game. In Mini Royale, all of the characters that you win in Mini Royale are playable in Dookie Dash, right? The characters that you have utility in Mini Royale, they also have utility in both Dookie Dash, Legends of the Mara, and a bunch of other games, right? So it's like if you look at Mini Royale as a good like entry point, browser based, super easy to have a Faraway account, win assets, take those assets to other games in our ecosystem. Great, that's awesome. We might not have to worry about paying as much for acquisition for Dookie Dash or for Serum City or for Shadowline. But yeah, I think when we look at games, we look at here are high top of funnel games and looking at that from both a genre perspective as well as a platform perspective. And then we also look at here are the games that are going to monetize. And for us, that interoperability is the glue that keeps them in our ecosystem.
And are there certain rewards that you think will compel people more than others to kind of get pushed across the titles on the platform?
Yeah, we have this system called like engrams and wishes. It's like a double gotcha. It's more complex. But basically, there are rewards that can drip out of each game that can give rewards in other games and can also give rewards on like a faraway ecosystem level as well, right? Which can be used anywhere. So it's like a system that's sort of meant to connect all the different games. And each of those games, we give certain amounts of engrams and wishes that they can give out on a per epoch basis, right? They can decide what an epoch is for them, but it could be a weekly leaderboard, it could be a season leaderboard, it could be some mission that lasts X amount of time in order to do. But yeah, I think we try to use NFTs, or I think just items in general, in order to connect all of the experiences together.
Do you think of like items at like the metagame level in terms of like a common asset is limited to a specific game and maybe that's a consumable or something, and then as you kind of go higher up the rarity stack, so to speak, or hierarchy, maybe you have the interoperable asset that is like scarce and provides more utility than others, maybe an earning potential. Is that kind of one way to think about it?
Yeah, definitely one way to think about it. Yeah, there's some assets that we consider higher value, and the people that own those assets, like we definitely want to keep in our ecosystem. So, right, when you have like a high value asset owned by a high value player, like it's good to give that asset as much utility in as many places as possible.
Yeah, I think it's I think an interesting case study for this idea of like collateralized LTV is MiHoYo.
I
Um,
think their mistake is the cannibalization between all of the different
yeah,
player bases, right? It's the same game, same player, where they realistically can't play all of those games at the same time because it's very, very similar games and deep, deep time investment required for each of those games, right? So I think the better example here is what Deep Rock Galactic is doing with their Vampire Survivor game. I think what League of Legends is doing also with their Vampire Survivor slash, whatever Archero-esque type of game. I think that's interesting. You know what I mean? It's less time investment. So that's another thing that we also think about too. It's like we want players to play more than one thing at any given time. So when we think about genres, we think about like, you know what, like Legends of the Mara idle game. Like you go in there like once a week or something and like set up your strategy. Like Mini Royale, you play it, casually when you're at the office or something, There's Shadowline where you like get hooked in. You hooked in, you play events, you do all of these things. Like Dookie Dash, you play like when you're waiting in line at Starbucks.
and that about wraps it up for this session. Um, Alex, it's been great, man. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts, insights, etc. Yeah, man. Thanks.
Well, thank you for having me.
The content of this video is intended for informational purposes only and should not be considered as investment advice. The views shared by Alex and I are our own, and we may hold investments in some of the companies or digital assets featured in the video.